One of the YouTube people I like to follow is Joe Kuhn. And he basically said recently retirement planning is easy in the accumulation stage, but it becomes graduate school when you're planning for retirement. In other words, the withdrawal stage, it gets a lot more complex. There are a lot more moving parts, all interrelated. We need to consider things like your asset allocation. What will your withdrawal percentage be? How will you deal with sequence of returns risk? What COLA will you use? Will you spend less in your slow go years and no go years than you do in your go go years? So, what we do is set up spreadsheets to run numbers, and what we do on this channel is simply take Warren Buffett's simple advice. Use an S&P 500 index fund because it's the best option for most investors. This is in the accumulation stage because you follow the simple advice consistently over the decades, and you're probably going to end up a middle class millionaire. So let's go ahead and look at one of the spreadsheets that we set up, one of the many that we set up on this channel. I've already run some numbers here. Let's say, for example, you have $650,000. You're ready to retire. You figure you need $5,000 a month, and you're going to get $1,800 from Social Security, which means you need $3,200 coming from your nest egg. And what we do on this channel is run the numbers using the S&P 500 returns for the last 100 years. We assume it's probably not going to be any worse or any better what's happened in the last 100 years, and so we just project what similar returns might do for you in the future. In this scenario, if we have a 50-50 asset allocation, 50% staying in the S&P 500 and 50% going over some cash bucket over bucket that you can take out money of when the market's going down because you don't want to sell low, how many times would you run out of money? This shows you using the numbers for the last 100 years. After 10 years, what you would have left. In fact, these are 1925 numbers showing you right down through here. You can see you'd have 426,508. You can see it right there. But after 20 years, you're down to 49,000. And this actually shows you in the red the times that you would run out of money. After 20 years, you'd run out of money almost 31% of the time using these numbers. 30 years, it gets even worse. Over half the time, 54% of the time, you actually run out of money using these numbers. Let's look at the actual graph here. Here's the 31% of the time running out of money, but look at the 30-year period. Over half the time you're running out of money using numbers for the last 100 years. So what we need to do is what could you do differently? What's the problem here? The problem is you've got your percentage too high. It's close to 6% withdrawal rate. Watch what happens if we go to and also your asset allocation. Watch what happens when we go to a 70-30, meaning more staying in the S&P 500, less going over the bucket here. You want some in your bucket so it can survive some of these down years initially. But watch what happens if we go simply from a 50-50 asset allocation to a 70-30 asset allocation. What would you think might happen? Going from a 31% failure rate. Again, it's taken a minute to recalculate all these. This is where you'd be after 10, 20, and 30 years. 30 years, a 54% failure rate with a 50-50 asset allocation. Because of this right here, there's 5.91. Look at the vast improvement. You'll see it in a second. Just going with a 70-30 asset allocation. Now you just have an 11% failure rate for 20 years. You can see it right here, much better. And over the 30-year period, much better. But again, if you're not comfortable with 11% failure rate, what could you do differently? Well, folks, we also mentioned this right here. What COLA will you use, and will you spend less in your slow go and no go years? We like to set up the spreadsheet to take all of these into account. And I can testify, being 71 years old, that this second decade of retirement, we spend less than we did the first one. The first decade, we did a lot of traveling. What I'm going to do is go ahead and use the second decade, you're going to take less out. You can see right down through here the numbers we're using. The second decade, we're going to take 10% less, and the third decade, we're not going to use the COLA at all. But we also want to do what's called when the market's going down, we aren't going to take a COLA at all the next year, because that helps to deal with the sequence of returns risk when you take a little bit less out when you have down years. Again, if you have 4 down years in a row, like 1929, you're going to stay at this 3602 for quite a while. Now, if you use some of these other years, let's go to the most recent decade where we had a down decade, the year 2000. Then you've got 3 down years where you're staying the same. But how does this change everything? Again, we're going to stay with the 70-30 asset allocation. We're going to stay with this 5.91% withdrawal rate, which is still kind of high, but you can mitigate that if you consider the second and third decades, you're taking out a little bit less because your expenses are probably going to go down as you age. I realize this isn't taking into account Medicare expenses, but let's just go ahead and see how this affects us 11%. 11% isn't bad, but over a 30-year period, you're down a 24% failure rate. You can see it right there. But as we use a recalculation here, taking into account these decades taken out less in the second and third decades, and also not taking a COLA after that, now you're down to a 7% failure rate, which is a whole lot better. Just a few times around the Depression years and a few times around the year 2000 are the only times you're having problems. Remember what it was when you did 50-50 and didn't take into account all these? We had a 31% failure rate. The graphs looked horrible, and that was after 20 years. After 30 years, it was actually 54%. But now you can see it's so much better just doing a few variables that are really realistic. You're probably going to spend less in your second decade than you did in your first decade. And if you don't take a COLA after negative years, that can really help also. But folks, that's what we do on this channel. We just love running numbers for people. We do create all kinds of different spreadsheets, running all kinds of different scenarios. And this one, we actually looked at these kind of situations here, how you might deal with sequence of returns risk by not taking a COLA after a negative year. We looked at what happens when you spend a little bit less in your slow go and no go years, how that can really impact how long your money might last. And we saw that you got down so you only have 7% problem after 20 years and actually just a 5% problem after 30 years. And that was during the Depression type years. But that's what we do on this channel. We love creating spreadsheets for people, setting up numbers. That's what we love to hear from you. Tell me how I might be able to improve this channel to run spreadsheets that can really benefit you. So if you have no idea what your retirement might look like, check out some of the other videos on this channel. I think you will be amazed. Please consider subscribing to this channel. Please share this channel with others. Let people know about this channel, that we run numbers for people, just using Warren Buffett's simple advice. Please like the video, and thanks so much for watching.